Thanks so much. And Melanie, welcome.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with everybody. And just for the record, can everybody see my screen? You should be able to see a keynote lecture.
Yes,
It's
we
up
can see
right
you.
now. Okay, great. So let me just hit play and it should go to full screen. And if at any time the slides start to slow down or volume gets messed up, Mary, please feel free to let me know. So what I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight is photographing the human subject. And as I was preparing this lecture, I kind of thought to myself, all these in-depth details about why I like to photograph it and who my influences are. And, I rely heavily on trying to capture certain moments. And actually, back in November, I gave a Pecha Kucha lecture in Hamilton, Bermuda, about capturing specific moments in commercial photography. Pecha Kucha is a type of lecture where you have basically 7-ish minutes to run through 20 different images and tell a really fast lecture. So it's like TED Talks on speed. So initially I was going to talk a little bit about that, but I thought given that you guys are all college students or faculty members, I wanted to focus a little bit more on the academic side of learning how to photograph the human subject. So before we get started, I want you guys to consider a couple different questions, regardless of the genre that you're interested in. It doesn't matter if you're interested in photojournalism, documentary, wedding photography, maternity, pet, whatever it is. Ask yourself these questions. Why do you photograph people?
Hey, Melanie, hang on. They're saying you're
Yes.
a little hard to hear. I'm getting a couple of people saying that.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Let me try to turn my volume up.
Yeah, you guys, if anything like that happens during the webinar, go ahead and you might want to check your volume settings on your computer as well, because I see a couple of people now saying that she sounds fine. But so could be a
Okay.
couple of things. I think we're good now.
Could be a couple of things. And it definitely could be my input sound because as you can see, it starts to maneuver around a little bit there. So hopefully it'll stay at about 75%. But thank you all for letting me know that that was a little low. Okay, so back to these questions. Regardless of the genre, why do you photograph people? You might photograph people because your assignment says you have to, and you're sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, who am I going to photograph this time? Or you might photograph people because you're really into wedding photography, or you're really into maternity, or really into boudoir photography, and that's fine too. But let's dig a little bit deeper about that. Which one of your past photo shoots really made you fall in love with photographing the human subject? There might be one specific project that you worked on where you came home, put those images on the computer, and thought, wow, I nailed it. This is great. I love doing this. So when you look at those pictures, you might get a certain feeling, or when you take those pictures, you might get a certain feeling. So what do you feel, or what emotion comes up within you when you take those pictures of people? Is it excitement? Are you nervous? Are you feeling exactly what this couple is feeling, assuming you're photographing an engagement or wedding shoot? And what do you feel when you look at other people's photos? Let's say that you're on the internet and you're looking at portraits taken by Annie Leibovitz or Sally Mann or Shelby Lee Adams, and you're looking at those images. What do you feel when you look at those images? And finally, let's combine the third and the fourth questions. How can you create that same feeling that you get when you look at somebody who you admire's work within your own images? So these are some questions that I want you guys to kind of think about as we kind of stroll down memory lane in terms of my own academic past. Um, and what's really important to remember, what I call the golden rule of photographing the human subject. Photographer plus human subject equals collaboration. There's no way around it. Nobody is essentially the boss in this instance. It really is up to the photographer to talk to the human person, client, whatever, and direct them in a manner that the photographer might see fit. However, it's the subject who takes that direction and then applies that additional emotion back into the picture. So the two really go hand in hand, in my opinion. And I think that you'll find that when you slowly start to adapt this quote unquote golden rule into your own work, you'll find yourself capturing stronger images and being able to portray a stronger emotion. So, what did I learn in school about photography? Of course, I'm learning what all of you learned or learning, because it doesn't matter how high of an education you get, you're constantly still going to be a student. So, still learning, have learned. Of course, we learn about camera gear, we learn about lighting, we learn about contemporary historical photographers that might inspire our own work. We learn about the business of photography, we learn about photo history. Back when I was in college, it was the darkroom days, so I learned a lot about film and negatives and developing and printing. This list could go on forever for what I actually learned. But what we want to focus on today is how did I learn to photograph the human subject? And the main thing that it comes down to is really experience, patience, and more experience. Every photo shoot, even for me today, is a trial and error. Whether it's a trial and error in the field or in the studio or in my business practice for my small freelance business called Fiander Photo, it's all about experience. And what's also is important to remember is what might work for one photographer may not necessarily work for you. You are your own person and you're conducting your own brand and your own business, and you want to make sure that it all kind of flows nicely for you. So let's take a peek back. I'm going to travel back in time. We're all going back to 2004. I know we all remember that year. Some maybe better than others. But these were the images that I submitted for my thesis in undergrad. And I knew I wanted to photograph people. And I knew I wanted to photograph people who I knew really well and who were a part of my life and who inspired me. And I wouldn't say I was necessarily concentrating so much on who my historical influences were. At this time I was, how old? 22-ish. And photographing, for example, here, my grandmother. Um, and what I came to learn very quickly after I took this picture was that my grandmother did not like having her picture taken. And that was a quick lesson. How do you photograph somebody who really does not like to be in front of the camera? And I'm sure we've all been there before, either on assignment or even in the case where we've been hired by a client and we show up to the wedding or the shoot or whatever, and they're like, oh, don't take my picture, I don't know. And I'm like, well, but you paid me to be here to take your picture. So how do you go about dealing with that challenge? That is always a really big challenge. Same day, this is around Thanksgiving dinner table. It was a break from school. I was away with my family and at the dinner table. My grandfather on the left and my father on the right. And learning not just about how to photograph people. I think after I snapped that shot of my grandmother, I thought, maybe I should be a little incognito. And I, put the camera on the table and tried to capture more of an honest moment, more of this glance that my grandfather's giving my father of whatever they were talking about that day. And even again, trying to capture that incognito moment of, putting the camera on the table and capturing a little bit of motion, trying to get, this is my Aunt Judy, her high energy, capture that motion and that emotion in the picture itself. And then again, there's also dealing with people who are very comfortable in front of the camera. This is my best friend, whose name is also Melanie, and her dog. And um, she's always been a great model for me. Anytime I need a model, I always call her, and she's just very comfortable. She's always like, "What do you want me to do? Stand here, lie like this, and whatever." And she's all over my portfolio. And I'm sure you guys also have that person in your life who you can always count on to be a good subject. And so sometimes when you're photographing somebody that you know really well, it's not as big of, shall I say, challenge. So you might hear a lot of the times in the classroom, you might hear your professor say, photograph somebody new, photograph someone who you don't know that well. And the reason being is because it really pushes you to learn those additional lessons of how to photograph the human subject. So in my undergrad day, I was, surrounded by all these other art students. So naturally, I photographed them in their own environment. These were some students at my school who I photographed, hanging out on the lawn. One girl was doing her nails, another girl was drawing, one girl was, doing whatever, just hanging out basically. And I just wanted to capture a couple of pictures of them. This is my high school art teacher, again, still staying with that undergrad thesis, photographing people that I know and trying to capture them in their own element. So what was important that I learned in this particular instance is that I kind of imagined my high school art teacher, when I went back to photograph her, being in the classroom. But that wasn't necessarily her environment. Her environment was her own studio, doing her drawings and kind of just being herself in her own world. So I had to learn to change my expectations. And a lot of times you might go into a photo shoot and you think, okay, it's going to be exactly like this. You've got it right in this little box. You know what props you're going to use. You know what style of lighting it's going to be, everything. And then you get there to photograph the subject and it is not at all what you thought it was going to be. That happens all the time. And that was a lesson that I learned not only in this picture, but in this photograph as well, where I went to photograph another friend of mine, and he was just in constant talking mode, smoking cigarettes, moving all over the place. And I had to, again, similar to that shot that I showed you of my Aunt Judy, where her hands are kind of moving, capture that motion to be able to express, his own kind of gestures and personality. This is another example. This is my photography professor from when I was in undergrad, Professor Lyons, and we must have shot, I don't even know how many pictures to get this one particular image, but she had on multiple props. Now, of course, I'm photographing my mentor in photography, so she was a little bit more open to working with me and what I kind of wanted to capture. But again, it's always a learning experience. So after graduate school, I decided, I was really into this idea of photographing people. I didn't necessarily know why I liked it so much. I knew who my inspirations were at this time. I really liked Mary Ellen Mark, and I liked the idea of documenting experiences. And in my mind, I was documenting those who were important to me. They might not necessarily have been a month-long project of people performing in the circus or something like that, but these were people who were kind of brought me to where I was at that point in time. So my professor, the woman who I just showed you a picture of, Patty Lyons, she kind of encouraged me to go to this school in Portland, Maine called the Salt Institute for Documentary Studies. And she said, look, it seems like you're really interested in documentary photography, and I think you should pursue this idea. And me being from the Washington, D.C. area, I was like, Maine? It's really cold in Maine. And that was my first initial reaction. But nonetheless, I applied to go to the school. It was a 4-month program. And while I was up there, I fell in love with another school, Maine College of Art, and that's where I ended up going to grad school. Long story short, I spent 5.5 years in cold Maine, which turned out to be a huge learning experience for me in terms of photography. And that's what I'm going to also talk to you about this evening. So once I started going to school at the SALT Institute, they basically said, okay, look, you're going into graduate school, so you're going to work on 3 different projects, 2 of which I'm going to show you this evening. The first project that I worked on was a story, a photo essay about a Jesuit priest named Father Bob. And I followed him around for 4 months and basically told his life story. So this is during the time Terry Schiavo was very ill, and they were debating whether or not it was right to keep her alive or not. The Pope was very sick. He was dying. So there was a lot of stuff going on in the Catholic world. And me being the photographer, what I wanted to do was just purely document it, not give my opinion, not state where I was coming from in terms of religion or even the history of religion or whatever. I just wanted to tell a pure story of this man. So, Father Bob, what I learned about him is this, and it was also about communication, learning how to communicate with somebody who is much different from me, meaning I'm a girl, he's a guy. I was 20-ish, he was in his late 70s, and learning how to communicate with somebody who had led a very different life than I had. And we may not necessarily have had a lot in common, but by photographing him and learning more about him, I was able to gain a little bit more about his lifestyle. So I learned that he was the chaplain of a fire department. This is actually him in the fire truck here, just rolling around with the crew, getting ready to say mass. And a lot of the times when I was taking these pictures, I wasn't necessarily, I mean, I was kind of all up in his face with the camera, but I wasn't necessarily only focusing on the picture. What I found myself doing was really focusing on him as a person and wanting to capture this vibrant energy that he had. I had never met a guy who had so much energy, and he really was kind of the example of not just a good Jesuit priest, but just a good man. You know, went to go visit his friends. This is him visiting one of his friends who was really sick at the time. Him hanging out with his other priest friends and what they do in their off time, which the gentleman on the left loved to cook, and he was a great storyteller. And Father Bob was just kind of the guy who, hung out, told a lot of jokes, and was really, kind of your picturesque priest, I suppose. And what I also learned about him was that he had taught English in Iraq back in the 1960s. And on many occasions, he would wear this garb that he had purchased there just because it was kind of a comfortable thing for him to wear when it was a little bit chilly outside, as you can imagine in Maine. And you can see the trees here were also, a little bare, minus that pine tree in the background. And he loved to go for walks. So every morning he would go for a walk, and he would also pick up every single can or glass bottle that he would find in order to bring it to the recycling bin. So we would go on these like 3-mile walks just around the neighborhood or wherever, and he'd come back with 10 different cans in his pockets, and he was saying, well, I'm just just cleaning up, just helping out. So he was a really interesting guy, definitely kept up with the news and what was going on. We went to a friend's house for Easter, so we drove down to Connecticut together. This is him saying mass just in a small chapel. So what was important here was, it's not just about capturing him as a person, but also him in his position, in his job, paying close attention to detail with the smoke and the lighting and that sort of thing. And this is all what I was learning before going to graduate school, learning how to pan, again, capturing him doing his job and his position. Again, capturing that motion, a nice detail. You'll probably hear your professor say all the time, adjust your focal length. Capture a close-up, capture a medium length shot, capture a wide angle shot. And I was being told the exact same thing throughout these 4 months of attending school here. Typical everyday situation, shaving. So I documented it. And sometimes I kind of found myself thinking, what in the world am I doing? What am I going to do with these pictures? What am I learning here? And a lot of it was basically just learning how to communicate with somebody else. Again, going back to that golden rule, photographer plus human subject equals collaboration. And that's exactly what I was learning in this situation. The other project that I was working on simultaneous to photographing Father Bob was I was photographing this 28-year-old chef named Eric, who opened up this really expensive restaurant in Portland, Maine. So this was roughly 2000, what year was this? 2005. And the economy was starting to slip. Not hadn't slipped yet, but it was starting to slip, and it was affecting Portland, Maine pretty hard, say in comparison to larger cities. So here's this young 28-year-old with a bunch of investors who just opened up this fantastic and phenomenally expensive restaurant. So this is them preparing in the kitchen a couple of hours before. Eric moving around, panning, between the stove and the dishes that he was preparing to go out. This is a different day before opening. He had remembered at this moment that he had forgotten to make the bread for the evening, so he was like, oh, kind of slapping his head a little bit here. And, what else I learned, and particularly in this situation, at the time, I didn't realize what the overall story about this restaurant was, or really how it would apply to my life later down the line. But looking back, I think it was really about capturing the pressures of owning a restaurant or even working in a restaurant. If anybody here has either worked in a kitchen or been a waitress or had some type of position in a restaurant, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Being in quote unquote the industry is really difficult, and there are a lot of things that can be stressful. For example, what do you do when an entire pig shows up at your restaurant? It takes hours to break that pig down. So a lot of this time was spent with me just basically trying to stay out of the way. Um, so with Father Bob, I could be, right there in front of him and he didn't care. Although in the kitchen, I had to stay out of the way, not only so I didn't freak my subjects out, but also so I didn't get stuff splattered on me, hot grease or whatever. So two very different situations where I probably had more in common with this particular chef. He was, a little bit older than me. He had, he was dating somebody, and there was a lot of music that we had in common, and that kind of thing. And we ended up being friends for many years after this. So speaking of the person that he was dating, not only was I photographing him in the kitchen, but I would also go to their home and go on, walks with them, similar to what I would do with Father Bob, and photograph them in their, kind of their off day. This is Eric seen here at his home, cooking at home. This looks like a perfectly safe situation. Joking, of course, don't do this at home. But just kind of capturing those two different atmospheres. In one situation, he's really focusing on being this high-end French chef, and in this other situation, he's just a regular guy at home getting the coals lit by whatever means necessary. The gentleman on the left was actually his sous chef. Eric is the main subject, seen standing on the chair photographing the new baby. And the woman on the very right is the sous chef's wife. And this was his girlfriend, kind of in the center, also holding a camera. So again, not just focusing on their situation at work, but also focusing on their situation at home. And I think that is what really kind of is documentary. Me personally, this was me learning the difference between being a documentary photographer and being a photojournalist. Photojournalists go in, they get the job done, and they go home, send the images to their editor, and check you later. But with documentary, you're going into a much deeper situation, only because, not, I wouldn't say deeper, but a more prolonged situation. So that's what was occurring here. I would stay at the restaurant with them after work, them hanging out, smoking around the bar, whatever people do. Again, this would probably not be seen today, as it's 2014. This was a long time ago, so smoking in any restaurants is now definitely out of the question. But it allowed me also, this particular situation of just hanging out with those who worked in the kitchen kind of allowed me to relax in my position as a photographer. I still had my camera, so I was still being professional, but I was also able to relax myself. And in that case, the subjects would relax in front of me, which allowed me to be more of a quote fly on the wall and capture the truth of a story. So once I got to documentary school, basically I went to undergrad, then I went to SALT, did those couple of documentary stories, and then I got to graduate school. I went to Maine College of Art, And I realized that, you don't really get an exact assignment. You don't have an instructor in grad school who says you're going to shoot 40 images, you're going to use it, two different lights for this, and you have to use a new subject. Basically, I got to grad school and they said, okay, what are you working on? And I was like, what do you mean? Don't we have an assignment? So, I was a little confused. So I started thinking, okay, well, I still wanted to document stuff, but I don't want to be as strict of a documentary photographer as I was while I was at SALT. So I switched formats, thinking that instead of shooting a 35 millimeter, and this is all still using film, instead of shooting a 35 millimeter, I switched over to a Holga camera, wanted to, use a smaller camera, a cheaper camera. If I lost it, it didn't matter. Like I could bang it around or whatever. And I started photographing this Sudanese family that I had met in Portland one day. There was actually this rally the summer of 2005 because the president had just been shot down in a helicopter. And Portland, Maine actually has a very large Sudanese community. So I'm just walking to work one day and I recognized the gentleman on the left because I had seen his picture before. So I went up to him and I said, "Hey, isn't your name Hassan?" He said, "Yeah." I said, I saw your pictures at Salt." And he was like, "Oh, wow, crazy." So for the next 2.5, 3 years, I spent photographing this family. Now, some might say that's a very long time, and some might say that's not a very long time at all. But regardless, that was the amount of time that I spent with these people. And what I wanted to capture was how their children were being raised at home with very deep Sudanese roots, and how they were also being affected by the culture that was in Portland, Maine. How were these parents allowing their kids or teaching their kids to hold on to their own roots and their own culture? So that was really interesting to me to see this division between the two. And what else was important to me was not just focusing on Hassan and his family, but to also focus on those who came over to his house. His house was like the hub of the Sudanese community. Everybody was always calling, he was always on the phone. People were always coming over to visit, asking him to help them with their paperwork, and they were constantly trying to get more of those in their community who had since left Sudan and moved to different countries, trying to get them over to the United States so they could all be together and live together and work together to try to make a difference in their home country. So this was after Halloween, which isn't necessarily, a tradition in their country. In the Muslim religion, they have Eid, where the kids do get treats. But this was very around the same time this particular year. But this was a different experience for the kids. They had never been trick or treating before, and the concept of going up to people's doors and knocking on the door in the middle of the night was a little off. So I went with the kids to go trick or treating, and this is them kind of counting their loot back home, and the parents were also kind of, you know, interested in what they had received when they actually got back home. So it was kind of interesting. And what you probably will notice with some of these images is that my style is very different. I'm shooting with, a flash in a lot of these images, very hard light, versus to when I was shooting documentary, a lot of it was shot under natural lighting. So I'm learning how to experiment with light. And a lot of the images, it wasn't my best experimentation, I'll tell you that. These are not a lot of pictures that I show everybody. But it was a learning experience, and that's what it's really all about. So these were the kids after they had eaten a Ramadan meal. They were all kind of piled into this one room, and they all had oranges as dessert. So these were the kids kind of saying, "Well, I'll give you this, I'll take yours," and kind of a trading situation. And this is kind of a good example of what I was talking about a little earlier, trying to capture the difference between their Sudanese culture and our American culture. Now, of course, I'm going to put the term American culture into quotes because it can mean many different things. So in this case, what I'm referring to is this Western gun, this toy gun that this little boy is playing with. And I found it really ironic that his parents had left this war-torn country and they've come to the States and their child ends up playing with a toy gun. I wouldn't say that it's wrong. I just found it ironic. But they also noticed that every other kid on the block was playing with either a water gun or something else, and they might not have thought too much about it, but just in that moment I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. So while I was in grad school, what I really liked to focus on was this idea of telling a story, kind of sticking with, what I had initially been introduced to in, undergrad, telling the story of those I was influenced by, and, moving on to SALT, telling somebody else's story. Then I started to become interested in the idea of the moving picture. And the majority of my work from grad school, I will say, was based around film and digital imagery and the moving picture. And this is kind of where it started with, instead of cutting up my negatives to just be one singular picture, I started to look at them as emotion. So this is a brar. She's about 4 years old in this picture, and I think now she's about 12 or 13. It's pretty cool because she and I are friends on Facebook now, so I'm still staying in touch with these kids who live hundreds of miles away from me. But what is interesting about this picture is her just doing what every other little kid does, moving around, dancing, jumping all over the place, um, watching, and then, dancing and running all over the place, and then pausing for a moment in front of the television for like 5 seconds, and then moving again, you know. So it was about capturing their home lifestyle, what these kids did at home. I shot a lot of video of these guys, but given that today's lecture is on still photography, this is what I'm showing you. So let's get back to some of the things that I learned in terms of higher education, what I learned about photographing people in school. I learned that I had to make it personal, not just personal for myself, but personal experience for everybody. So going back to my family members who I photographed in undergrad, going back to those who I photographed at SALT, it wasn't just about what I wanted to capture. It was about what the subject wanted to share with me. And you might find yourself in that similar situation. Let's say that you're photographing a maternity shoot and you've got this whole idea set up, but the couple kind of wants something a little bit different. Always remember that it's about a personal experience, not only for yourself, but also for them. You want to make sure that you're telling the subject's story versus your story. Now, of course, that one kind of more so pertains to documentary. And if it is your story that you're telling, maybe that fits kind of into fashion or portraiture where you have a certain idea in mind, but it's always going to be a collaboration, regardless of the genre, and that's really how you're going to nail the shot. I also learned in higher education to not be late, because the few times that I was late, it was not a good thing, let me tell you. So arrive early, leave late. That's also what you'll hear a lot during your photojournalism classes. Be the first one there and the last one to leave, because if you're not early and if you leave early, then you might miss something going on in between. You're going to miss that great shot. Always be truthful, be polite, and be trustworthy. If your subject trusts you, then you're going to be able to capture a very essential emotion and a very serious moment. And that, in my opinion, really can't be faked. Then again, I'm coming from a strong documentary background, so that was kind of instilled in my mind a lot. But it can also be seen in commercial work. So what did I do after I got out of school? I went right for the gold, not necessarily in the photography sense, but well, yeah, let me back up a little bit before I say that. I kept shooting what I knew how to shoot. For example, I went up to Canada. My father's family, they're all fishermen. So for many days I went out with them and photographed them getting these herring. And I kind of kept going. I almost went back to when I was at SALT, like grad school didn't even happen. I just started photographing in a very strong documentary style. And continued to do that for a little bit longer. And once I got into that, I kind of realized that, it's not, I was kind of feeling the documentary work, but I wanted to do something different. At that point, I had been in school for so long that I decided that, I kind of wanted to move to something a little bit different. So I got a job working for this newspaper. It was called The Blue Room. This is one of the stories that I told. And this was kind of like a mini documentary, like a little mini photo essay where I started photographing this guy named Hectic, and that was his nickname. His real name was not Hectic. At least that's what he told me. And so I started photographing him, and I learned a lot about him. I learned that he was a cook at a restaurant, similar to a lot of people in Portland. That was like the big job in Maine, was working at a restaurant. And so I photographed him at work a couple different times. I also learned that he was a singer in a hip hop group, and he was also in a different band, a heavy metal band. So that was like two different personalities in the same person, which I always found kind of interesting. And he was just kind of a regular 20-something-year-old guy, lived by himself. Um, there wasn't a lady in this house, I'll say that, as you can see by the torn window sill thing. Maybe if you had a girlfriend, that would have been a little bit more spruced up. For stereotyping here, just as a joke. But what else was interesting about this guy was that he was heavy into the Viking culture, and that kind of threw me for a loop. I was like, "You're into what?" And he had many swords. Only in Maine do I think that you can bust out a sword like this in public and kind of swing it around this park. So, he was like, "I'm going to the park today with my sword. You want to come?" And I was like, "Well, let me grab my camera." So I grabbed my camera. We left his apartment. We went to the park. We took a ton of pictures. And that was really my first story that I shot outside of the school system. So I shot it in a very similar manner to what I shot at SALT, but I think that's because that's what I was comfortable with. Grad school was a lot of experimentation. And I wouldn't say that I didn't learn from that, but it definitely helped me to see lighting a little bit better. It helped me to communicate with my subjects a lot better. And I think that that's why my first experience shooting this guy was so successful, because um, I was able to communicate with him more. So eventually, grad school ends. Right after grad school, I started teaching a couple different courses as an adjunct. I also started working at a bar because I had some bills that I needed to pay. And I was freelancing for a newspaper. So I decided I'm going to do something totally new with photography. It was starting to wear on me a little bit. I think we've all been there before. It's kind of like writer's block, photography block. And I wrote myself a little message. So I'm saying, I've come to the conclusion that I need to leave Maine for multiple reasons. One, because the economy was going down, and I realized that I needed to leave. P.S. I didn't leave until March 2010. This was written December 2007. So that shows you how well this project worked out. So I'm saying, as of now, I'm not comfortable putting the reasons in print, but if I have learned anything from writing a thesis, the reasons will reveal themselves through my artwork, through my journals about the artwork, and in the mission statement in general. So this is my little mission statement. Until I pack up my apartment and life in Portland, Maine, I'm going to take one photograph per day. As a recent graduate of Maine College of Arts MFA program, I'm worried that my art practice is slipping without the comforts of the school environment. I'm hoping to push myself into my own studio practice with this project, and I'm also hoping to renew my image, to become fresh with new ideas as a person, a friend, a lover, and most importantly, as an artist. There are no set rules to this project. I imagine most of the photographs will be self-portraits that discuss time, action, or feeling. I also imagine, and this is the funny part, I also imagine that this mission statement will change. So I'm basically saying, this is my project, but it might change. So what I did, I mentioned that I got this job at a bar. As you can see in the picture in the lower left-hand corner, I was thrilled to be working at this bar. But what was fantastic about this experience, whether it was closing time, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, this is us just, we've closed down the bar, we've put all the money away, we've filled out everything we need to fill, and we're just hanging out, getting ready to go home. The picture in the upper right-hand corner is me walking to work in the snow. It was only like 3 blocks away, but in frigid temperatures, it was long in my mind. Lower left-hand corner, I was just having a bad night, so I went down to the basement to take my one picture that I had to take that day. In the lower right-hand corner, this was a picture of us just waiting for people to show up. If you've worked at a restaurant, you know that a lot of the time is spent waiting, so I thought, well, I'm just going to take a picture. So I shot all this Polaroid film. It was at that time, this was 2000, this was probably right before Christmas, so shortly after that mission statement was written. So Polaroid film was everywhere. It wasn't hard to come by like it is today. And, you know, it kind of taught me how, working at a bar also taught me how to communicate. I'll say that for sure. And I also made a ton of friends, which was fantastic because those friends ended up becoming some of my subjects and would allow me to take pictures of them. So I'm originally from DC. A lot of my friends were in the DC area. So after grad school, you know, all my friends left and moved away. And it was really that atmosphere at the bar that kind of opened me up to this whole different community in all these other subjects. So I learned how to speak to people who had grown up in Maine, who had led a very different lifestyle than I had, and who were also working in the industry. This was my first time working in the industry, and it's a different mindset from a lot of stuff that I had done in the past. And so, you know, not only was I photographing some of my friends at work, my coworkers or whatever, but I started photographing while I was on trips, and I learned myself how to be in front of the camera. And again, I wouldn't necessarily say that these are, you know, fabulous works of art, but it was a learning experience and it was a project. And if you know, what I would suggest to you is this. I know we're all very busy with the assignments that we're given and we have to turn in on time. But if you haven't set up some funky assignment for yourself where it's just purely about learning or purely about talking to people or purely about learning what you really want to do yourself a favor and set up that type of project. So this was that kind of project for me where I really learned to just kind of let go and do whatever I was going to do that day. So, example, somebody that I met at the bar, a nice portrait that I was able to capture. This is my friend Judd, and it was just gorgeous lighting that was coming into the windows at that time, and I was like, oh my gosh, let me grab my camera and snap a shot. And, you know, probably moments before this, we were just hanging out, having a beer, you know, just relaxing or whatever. But, you know, you also, as a photographer, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this, where you might just be sitting there and you think, oh my God, I gotta get my camera right now. The lighting is perfect. Don't move. And you run and go get your camera. And that was, you know, something that my friends came to be accustomed to. They just kind of knew, oh, she's the one with the camera. So, you know, a lot of people I met at this bar also worked next door. We had a tattoo parlor next door. So I was constantly over there taking pictures, mostly because they really didn't care if I was hanging out there or not. And their subjects didn't care. The gentleman on the left actually worked with me at the bar as well. He was a waiter too. And the gentleman on the right, the tattoo artist, this is Mark and Matt, he was at the bar, you know, every couple of days or so, just having a drink after work. And then, you know, a lot of pictures would come about. And I'm sure you guys have experienced that as well, where, you know, those who you're comfortable with, you can photograph them. And that is really the best time to learn because those people are going to be patient with you. At the same time, you want to expose yourself to the challenges of photographing those that you don't know. So you might photograph people, you know, if you're coming home from work and you guys are just hanging out, use that as an opportunity to take a picture. This image, for example, Mark was getting a phone call from his girlfriend, and he just kind of had this really, um, you know, just serious look on his face. So I grabbed my camera and took an image. This was one of the cooks that I worked with. His name is Johnny, and we went with a couple of other people. We drove north to Booth Bay, and Johnny loved to write. So I knew I wanted to capture a portrait of him that day that kind of focused on that. And regardless of where we went, Johnny always has something to write with and something to write on. So I wanted to focus on that aspect about him to be able to tell a little bit more about his personality. So where does this all lead today? Today, if you guys had checked out my website before this lecture, you know that my work is not necessarily based around photographing friends or family, but it's really based around wedding photography, engagements, maternity. But all of the stuff that I learned in college, pre-grad, grad, and afterwards, as kind of like somebody who gets out of grad school and you're just kind of struggling a little bit, all of those experiences kind of led up to these moments of the work that I, and a lot of it is based around weddings, and I still shoot weddings in more of a photojournalism manner, and I also shoot them in a posed manner. And for me, as I mentioned a little earlier, it's about capturing a certain moment. um, I'm sure a lot of us have studied Henry Cartier-Bresson and his notion of, capturing the right moment. And that's kind of what I like to do, be that fly on the wall and pay attention to lighting and pay attention to angles and being able to capture certain moments. So what do my clients want and how do I get that from them? Basically what a lot of them are looking for, it's not just the photojournalism manner. That might have been what attracted them to my style, but everybody still wants those posed pictures. So being able to capture that eye lock or that connection, and a lot of it has to do with me giving them direction, knowing how to communicate with them. A lot of times, you might get an email from somebody, you show up to the shoot and you've never met them personally, you don't know much about them. So you have to be able to use your people skills and think on a fly and be able to communicate with them about what exactly you're looking for. Again, keeping all the technical stuff in mind, going from medium format to a wider angle shot. And sometimes the direction might just be as simple as, can you guys give me a sweet little kiss? Or sometimes the direction might be a little bit more difficult where you have to ask a bride to run back and forth 30 different times so you can get this one shot. Luckily, this bride did not mind running back and forth. But I'm sure that if she did mind, I would have been able to see it on her face. So it's not just about communicating, but it's also about paying attention to what your subject might be telling you. If you get the notion that your subject is tired and they're over it, but they still have an hour left in their photo shoot, let it go. Let that hour go and just say, how are you guys feeling? Do you feel like you want to maybe pick this up a different day, if that's an option? Or just you got to work with what you've got. So again, another photojournalism shot, kind of sneaking up behind one of the bridesmaids, getting ready, doing her makeup in the mirror. And maternity shots are interesting because you always know that the client has called you and said, I want these pictures. So it's hard to capture a photo J shot because it's all about posing. It's all about that emotion. And this is one of my clients in Bermuda, and she wanted a portrait of herself on her husband's family homestead. So this property has been in her husband's family for generations, and it's kind of worn down now. And she says she just felt comfortable there. She feels really comfortable. It's right on the water, and I wanted to really emphasize her belly and her comfort level. So before this shot was taken, we were just having a conversation. Olga, you look beautiful. The wind is, very still right now. Just be really quiet and just, it's almost like a yoga session sometimes where you just have to like calm them right down. Because again, it can be nerve-wracking during any type of shoot. Luckily, at a wedding, there's a lot of distractions, right? The bride's getting her hair done, her makeup done, the groom is tying their shoes or hanging out or whatever. And you can kind of capture these moments by being a fly on the wall. Everybody's giving a big cheers before they go out, and you can kind of position yourself in a certain angle that focuses on that cheers. Again, a distraction where a bridesmaid was kind of bustling up the bride's gown, and I was able to get a really close-in shot and focus on those hands. And a lot of times when I'm taking these pictures, again, communication. It's all about talking to them. It might not even be about talking to them about photography. In fact, in most cases, it's not. A lot of things are like, so how'd you guys meet? How far along are you? Do you know what colors you want in your nursery? Or, just making conversation to make that person feel comfortable. This one, for example, was kind of a more formal situation, so I did have to say, what was the bride's name? Caitlin. I said, Caitlin, can you please put your, lean your shoulder or lean your head down on Jim's shoulder there? And she kind of like laid her head down a little bit here. When you're working with a bridal portrait, it's all about communication. It's all about talking to the bride and telling them exactly what you want them to do. Now, if you're giving them direction and you're shy about giving them direction, you know, that's something that it's hard to overcome. For example, when you say, okay, just put your chin down, and they like slam their chin to their neck, and you're like, okay, not that far. So then you want them to lift their chin. You know, use words like, can you just lower your chin gently? Good. And sometimes you actually have to step into the frame and, you know, gently touch their face and kind of say, okay, let's just maneuver you a little bit like this. Um, so a lot of this, again, it's all about communicating, knowing when to pull away, knowing that this is a collaboration that occurs between you and the person that you're photographing, capturing either a funny moment or, you know, a quiet moment, getting that eye lock together, whether it's a married couple. This is an engagement picture here, for example, another engagement shot. And a lot of times with my engagement pictures, it's not necessarily about what the couple is doing. I mean, let's be realistic. These people are just standing there looking at each other. But what makes this a great shot is the lighting. You know, so you want to say to them, make sure that they know that you're thinking about the lighting. So they actually had posed on the steps that I was standing on here, and I said, actually, can you guys just back it up a little bit? Because I wanted that light to fall very nicely on them. Same bridal portrait as the girl with the veil. This was in New York City, and you know, this was another situation where I had to say, you know, okay, put your hands over your head, put one elbow over like this, you know, raise them up high, almost like she was doing a stretch. And until we got it just right, where I thought it was just elegant enough and just sexy enough to snap the photograph, and really also kind of focusing on the atmosphere behind her. This is another getting ready shot where the bride was kind of distracted because the woman behind her was doing her hair. And I just said, you know, Lena, can you just kind of look down a little bit so I can focus on your eyelashes? And I let them know what I'm taking a picture of, you know, so they know exactly what they're getting. Chances are good as they know my style, they know what I'm going to shoot during that day, but still you kind of want to talk about it. It's like going to the doctor and they tell you everything that they're checking out, or going to the dentist. I know my dentist is always like, okay, I just, you know, you got something shoved in your mouth. I'm like, okay, I'm just checking for this and this. And you're like, all right, well, at least he's telling me what he's doing. And it's kind of the same manner. Another thing is to always be prepared to capture that shot when you're not expecting it. You can see there's a mirror down on the table, and there's also some jewelry in the lower left-hand corner. So I was really photographing just the details of that day. Everybody wants a shot of the earrings or the bracelet or whatever. But what was really sweet about this moment is that the other daughter came in and was asking the mom if she could borrow some jewelry. So I kind of, you know, switched out from a close-up shot to a more of a wider angle shot to capture that reflection, and to also kind of capture that sweet moment where she's kind of, you know, putting her hand down, grabbing a piece of jewelry there. This was another maternity shot also taken in Bermuda, and this girl had grown up on a banana plantation, so it was really important for her to be, you know, photographed in this plantation in her family homestead. And the whole day I was like, oh my God, it's gonna rain, we're not gonna get a shot, you know. And it started getting really breezy, and she's like 8.5 months pregnant and totally miserable. And I'm like, okay, just stand there and let me take this picture. And she's new. So I kind of had to also, you know, you need to be a little empathetic with your subjects too. And, you know, if you see that they're in pain or uncomfortable, you know, just say, okay, you know, in this, for example, she started to hold her back. And I was like, all right, just hold that for 1 second. I snapped the picture and that's it. So sometimes you have to move quickly because your subject is, you know, as I said earlier, over it a little bit. Again, this is another example of just kind of giving them direction and saying, you know, just look gently up at the camera. This was shot under natural lighting, kind of coming through a window. And, you know, being able also to think on the fly. I think that's kind of the whole thing that you learn in photojournalism or documentary, knowing when to take that picture and taking so many pictures and knowing how to edit it down to that one exact shot that you want. So that's my presentation for today. And what I want you to do in this moment, you're free to ask me any questions that you'd want, but also think back to those questions that I asked you at the beginning of the lecture. Why do you take pictures? Which particular photo shoot have you done in the past made you really want to focus on photographing people? And, how can you bring about certain emotions in your own pictures? So that's the
Thanks,
complete
Melanie. That
that.
was
Yeah.
a, oh, sorry. Were you finished?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
No, I'm done.
That was a great presentation. We do have some questions that have come in during your talk, so I'm just going to go ahead with some of those. And of course, we have a few minutes here, so please feel free to, if you have some questions or want to address some of Melanie's questions from the beginning of the presentation, feel free to submit those, and I'll read those out. Arnett wants you to know that she volunteers with the Cross Public Affairs and has an assignment to take pictures of people using some exercise equipment that the Red Cross donated to the Wounded Warrior Project for rehabilitation. Do you have
Oh, nice.
ideas on how best to capture the full impact of what they did for them? She also wants to say that she's loving the idea of capturing motion.
Oh, nice. Well, that sounds like a really interesting assignment to be getting. The Wounded Warrior Project is a great. That's a great project. I love that project. If I were Arnett, what I would particularly focus on is not only the soldiers, but also focus on those who are working with them. And if you feel like you are not, I remember Mary mentioned something about equipment. If you feel like you are not as uh, confident in some of the equipment that they might ask you to use, you have two options. One, try it out and see how it goes. But given that you're going to be photographing people who you might not know that well, I would stick with what you're comfortable with, meaning, don't bother setting up a lot of lights. Maybe just use a handheld flash with a diffuser, or purely working with natural lighting would be best. I'm not entirely sure if I answered that question well. Was it more an equipment question?
It was equipment and approach, I think. Like,
Oh,
how
and
would you
approach.
approach? Mhm.
How would I approach it? Um, Again, get there really early and leave really late, and just be as personable as possible. And I think the thing to remember with this particular type of assignment is, knowing when to say something, knowing when not to say something, being polite, and just realizing that the people who are there have a lot of stuff on their minds. There's a lot of stuff going on in a situation like this, and you want to be able to take their picture truthfully, and that might just involve you being a little bit more of a fly on the wall. But again, if somebody kind of says something to you like, oh hey, who are you shooting for, or, what are you doing, just don't not answer them. Go ahead and give them a direct answer. But it almost sounds to me like it's going to be a photojournalism project, and I would just kind of approach it with caution, meaning, be that fly on the wall.
Thanks. Okay, Tina Brooks actually wanted you to know that she had you as a professor before and she really enjoyed the
Yeah.
presentation.
Oh,
But
thanks, Tina.
yeah, how she wants to know how many hours a week did you spend with the families and people you photographed?
um, a lot, probably more so than I should. And this is something that I still debate, because my instructors at the SALT Institute, and the question of what is documentary and what is not documentary sometimes will always is disputed and will always be disputed, and how close you allow yourself to get to the actual subjects. So I allowed myself to get very close with them because I was young and because I was in this learning environment and really wanted to focus on the communication. So let's say with Father Bob, for example, I might have spent on a typical day 4 or 5 hours with him and met up with him 2 to 3 times a week. The chef, I was spending a little bit more time with him because it was a little bit more of a relaxed environment. So I could put my camera down for a few hours. That's the other important thing to remember. Sometimes, when I would go over and hang out with the chef and his girlfriend and their friends and, whatever, sometimes I didn't even bring my camera, because it is about allowing them to feel comfortable with me being there with a camera. So when I showed back up with the camera, it wasn't as big of a deal. And oddly enough, that chef ended up asking me a couple years later to come back and photograph the opening of a different restaurant. So everybody has a different opinion on how to approach documentary work. And, like I said in the beginning of the lecture, it's really what works for you. A lot of it's trial and error. Where I'll say that I may have put my camera down too much and focused on the communication too much and less on the photography probably was with the Sudanese family, where looking back, I wish I would have had the camera a little bit more. So there is it is also learning about how to find that balance. Whereas the documentary project that I've currently been working on, and you guys can go to my website to check out a couple of pictures. It's about a father and son fishing team in Bermuda, and that's I've also learned a lot about that because it's a very personal story for me, and knowing when to put the camera down and when to pick it back up. So I would say if you're approaching a documentary story, Tina, that you might want to almost look at it like a part-time job, because it's very difficult for the subject for you to go in, maybe spend 4 or 5 hours with them one week, and then they don't hear from you, another week, and I'm like, what happened to that story?
Thanks. Christy has a question. It's kind of a two-parter. She really loved how you incorporated the documentary style into a wedding or portrait shoot, and thinks that adds so much more of a personal touch or story with your client's wedding experience. When editing down the images of the event, how many do you usually end up with, or does it depend on the event itself? Does it affect what you charge for the client for the images?
Mm, fabulous question. Um, and I'm going to link it to this webinar that I sat through this weekend on Creative Live. There was a great, I don't know if any of you guys caught it. It was a great webinar by this woman named Julia Keller, I believe. And she was talking about prices and sales for photographers. And me, typically, when I shoot a wedding, I might shoot 3,000 images. I don't go in with an assistant, I just go in by myself. So I might shoot 3,000 images and narrow those down to anywhere depending on the day, because some brides ask for less hours. If they only want me there for 6 hours, all my packages include 10 hours. But let's say they're like, well, I don't need you that long and let's save some money. They might not get as many pictures. So I will deliver to a couple anywhere between 700, 1,000, 1,200 images, something like that. Not everybody works like that. I'm a shoot and share photographer, meaning that I give them all of the decent high-res images. I don't give them all 3,000 that I shoot that day, because let's face it, some of them are out of focus, some kid ran into the shot, or somebody's got their eyes closed, or whatever. I edit out all of that stuff. But depending on for the price, it does alter depending on what I'm shooting. So let's say an engagement shoot, I usually shoot those for 3 hours or so. Sometimes that's too long for the couple. Typically, either well, I hate to say it for the gentleman in the room, but usually it's the groom who's like, okay, I'm done. No more pictures. And they just want to be done. So, for example, I had an engagement shoot in Bermuda over the Christmas holiday, and the groom was really into it, and the bride was like, okay, after an hour and a half, she was, all set. And so I said, well, you guys still have an hour and a half left on your shoot, so they got, less images because they kind of opted out for some of them. But it does depend on the price, or the price does depend on the package. If I'm shooting for a longer amount of time, that means that I'm going to have more images to narrow down, more images to edit, and it's going to take longer to put together as a final piece. So the smaller shoots that I'll do, either engagement or trash the dress or a bridal portrait or whatever, those are charged a little bit less. and they also receive less images. They might only receive, say, 100 or 120 images, and maybe I'll only have shot 300 or 400 pictures, so I narrow those down. Another school of thought is to not include 100 or 120 images. Some photographers, and I find this a lot with maternity photographers who specify with maternity, they might only offer their clients 30 to 40 images. Because I don't know if you guys have ever looked at an online gallery and been the recipient of an online gallery. It's a lot to take in, so you don't want your client to be like, oh my God, how am I going to weed through all this and pick which one I want prints of? So, it's kind of finding a balance depending on, what you're photographing and not overwhelming your client as well.
Great, thanks. Uh, Ara wants to know, or actually, I think she's answering your question. Why do I photograph people? Because I love the expression and personality you can capture. Looking at a photograph of a smile, you can see how happy they are through the eyes more than the smile.
Hmm, that's a good
Uh,
answer.
and
I
then,
would encourage her to dig deeper on that question.
okay. Tashonda has a
Very,
question, a two-parter here.
yeah.
How do you get over photo block? Also, as a military spouse, she comes in contact with many wives who are photographers, and this is the third base she's lived at. How does she separate herself from the crowd? What suggestions do you have
Mm,
about that?
yeah. The other day I was having a conversation with somebody and I said, being a photographer is just as popular as being a teacher or being what's another popular job? I don't know, coach, dentist. Well, I guess maybe being a dentist isn't that popular, but you get what I'm throwing. So, you know, it's always going to be a challenge to stand out in the crowd. And that's what a lot of our portfolio classes are based around, to learn how to, build your unique brand. And I would say, in order to, it seems like she has a good idea of what is quote unquote the crowd and how she needs to break out of that crowd. For me personally, it was adding a touch of photojournalism to my wedding images that now is kind of becoming the crowd. And so, but the best way to stay out of the crowd is to be aware of the crowd. So, look at many different blogs on a daily basis. I'll look at Petapixel, I'll go to Creative Live, I'll kind of scope out what a lot of other people are looking at. Rock the Shot, I check out that blog forum, and it's just really being aware of what is going on around you. If you have, excuse me, certain photographers who you follow on Facebook, follow them on Instagram. I think I'm following like Nat Geo and every single National Geographic photographer that they post to, or a lot of wedding blogs will tag the photographers that they use. So I follow all those photographers. And if I'm looking at it on Instagram or on Facebook, that's already a part of my daily internet activity, as, and I'm not embarrassed to say it. I'm comfortable with that. I start my day with a cup of coffee. I check my work email, check into my e-class online, and somewhere during lunchtime, I go onto Facebook or go onto Instagram and see what's going on out there in the real photo world, and kind of, it's almost like spying. You want to see what's going on. So if I were this, remind me of the student's name again, Mary, the
I'm
military one.
sorry, I already moved forward in the
Oh,
question
that's
list, so
okay.
I don't
That's
have it in
okay.
front of me.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. So if I were her, I would just, become as aware as possible as what these other photographers are doing. And but you don't just want to be different to be different. You want to find your own niche and things that you do differently. So if these photographers are shooting mainly in a studio, figure out how to shoot on location. I've shot a lot of different, or excuse me, I've had a lot of different military wives be in the classes, and depending on where they're stationed, some of the concerns might be, well, I don't have a car, I don't know the area very well, we just moved here. So really branch out into the community as much as you can and figure out the locations that you are okay to bring a camera to. I know a lot of times on a military base, it can be difficult to just bust out a camera anywhere. Figure out how you can really brand yourself and also how you can advertise. Advertising is key, especially in on a base. So if there's a specific newspaper that's going around, pay a little bit of extra money to advertise within that newspaper when you feel like your freelance business is ready.
Thanks, Melanie. A lot of people are asking about your choice to use black and white. I probably have 10 different questions about black and
Yeah,
white. So they generally are ranging is like, why is that your preference? Who inspires you that's a black and white photographer? And if they're putting together a portfolio, what do you think about using black and white versus color?
sure. That's a great question. And I'll just flip back to this image. Well, first of all, when I was in at the SALT school, the documentary school, we were shooting in black and white film because that's what we could develop in the dark room. We didn't have a color dark room, so we were all shooting black and white film. It's the cheapest, it's the easiest, it's what everybody learned, in undergrad. I took a color film class when I was an undergrad, but it was at the Corcoran School of Art Design in DC. And it was a much different approach. But how I now base that decision is mainly to do with what I'm capturing, how the lighting looks, and what colors are in the picture. So, for example, if I have an image that I see as successful, let's see, in color, um, for example, this image here, that red jacket really pops off that wall. So that's something that I definitely want to draw attention to. So I keep it in color. Um, this image here, there was a lot of different color going on, so I thought that it might look better in black and white. And what I try to teach my students, mainly in the upper level classes, is knowing the power of minimalism. If you've got so many different colors in a picture and the colors don't look good together, uh, it's not going to be a successful image. So sometimes I find myself in that situation where I might love this lighting scheme, this natural lighting scheme that's happening, and I love this particular, you know, metallicness, but the I don't know if you guys can see it or if I can. No, I can't get my cursor over it. But the really black part behind the couple, that was a deep red, and the stairs were like this obnoxious green. So I was like, okay, I don't want this to be a Christmas card. So it's a lot about color theory and paying attention to what you're probably learning in your first couple of art classes. This color here was a lot of mute tones, and I liked almost the pastel feel to it. This particular bride had on like a shirt. When you're a bride, you want to wear a shirt that you can easily take off and get into your dress because you don't want to mess up your hair and your makeup. But it was this like god awful olive green color. So I wanted to pull away from that and made that black and white. So a lot of my decisions based around color and black and white is really what colors are there and what I want to either keep in the shot or avoid in the shot. So the banana leaves were like really, really green. And she was wearing the dress that she has on was this gorgeous teal color that looked good. We were in a different location before we went down into the plantation. We were around these trees where that teal color looked great. And we kind of went down to the banana field, and it didn't match the scenery as well. So not only are you a photographer trying to capture great exposure, great lighting, but you're also a stylist, and you have to be a color theory person, and that all kind of plays into it. So in terms of my inspiration for black and white, I'm a huge Shelby Lee Adams fan. I love Sally Mann's black and white work. Um, and they were probably some of my bigger inspirations. I also worked for a photojournalist who was pretty heavy-handed in black and white work. His name was Thatcher Cook. He actually gave a lecture many moons ago, but um, yeah, so that kind of sums up that answer. I guess it's all about, does the color look good or does it not look good?
Robert Geyer adds in, and if it doesn't, if color doesn't add to the meaning, then it distracts. He's one of our
Totally.
faculty members.
Ex-
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly.
Um, Patrick asks, in an age of Instagram, iPhone apps, as well as the fact that DSLRs are readily available to anyone and where everyone can be a photographer, do you think those have changed the landscape of photography?
I mean, of course, it has. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, I don't know what else to, what a different field of profession is to compare it to. Uh, I kind of find being a photographer is like running the longest marathon you will ever run in your life, where you constantly have to keep up with the trends that are going on. I would imagine it's the same for fashion or any other industry that kind of evolves around social media. You know, and you're absolutely right. Anybody can go buy a DSLR, anybody can jump on Instagram, anybody can make a Facebook page. But what really makes the difference with being a successful photographer is not only can you capture the right picture and make it look nice, you know, can you get a good image, but can you run your business successfully? And that is really, really key. Me, for example, I would say that I have some strong suits in my business ethic, and I have some weak suits. There's things that I should definitely spruce up on, marketing, for example, or you know that kind of stuff. Not everybody can be great at everything, but you know that's why I sit through different webinars and try to learn from people who are making these like six-figure a year situations. What can I learn from them and that kind of stuff. So my advice to anybody who's, you know, worried about, you know, how do we be unique or how do we do this? The answer is kind of just like Nike's slogan. Just do it. Join Instagram, join Facebook, you know, buy your DSLR, use it until, my theory is use it until it dies. Don't worry about constantly buying the next best camera that comes out because every other month there's going to be something new and fantastic, but really focus on composition, lighting, business ethics, marketing, and in today's world, social media.
Okay, I think we're going to do one more question, and I know there's a lot of great questions here, so I'll make sure Melanie gets these. Remember, you can get in touch with her in our photography student professional network as well as through your classes. But we've got a couple of people here asking about motion. What advice
Mm,
can you give in capturing motion, and do you have any specific techniques that you can share when you're working with that?
yeah. Um, this, that's tough because some, you know, I wouldn't say that I necessarily, well, aside from the image of the bride running, where is that one? Where the girl's running through the field. I wouldn't say that I necessarily a lot of times set out to capture motion. Sometimes it's a part of the subject might be sitting still and their arm moves or something like that, and the motion is captured when the shutter speed is slow. So it might just be kind of cruising through the scene. But you know, sometimes you're either going to want to show a stopped motion or a blurred motion, and I know there are a lot of assignments throughout our classes that kind of focus on that. And it's really, you know, does that motion add to the content? Well, here, for example, I would say that it does add to the content because we know that the bride is running. Whether she's running for her life or away from the groom, I don't know. But, or running towards the groom, perhaps. But, you know, it adds some kind of extra element to the actual image. The other image that I was just looking at, I'm just going to breeze through here, the guy getting a shave. Um, you know, passing that little brush kind of over him, it's a little bit of blurred motion, not a lot, but you can tell that something is moving over him. And, just like anything else, you want to think, does it add to the story? Does it add to the image? Is it going to tell a little bit more about what's going on? But, you know, a lot of it, again, is trial and error. And I would say if you're interested in capturing motion, or if you have an assignment coming up that's about motion, definitely go ahead and come up with a concept. So, okay, I want to capture kids on a playground. All right, so I've got that concept. I know I'm going to need to use a slower shutter speed. I don't want to have too much light coming in, so I know I need to have a smaller aperture, you know, but I want the background to be blurry, so I need to shoot with a zoom lens. You know, you want to make sure that you think it all out. And a lot of times in situations, the bride one, for example, running through the field, I kind of wrote it all down in a notebook and said, okay, I know what this, I know what this, and it's like a math problem trying to figure it out at the end.
Great, Melanie. Thank you so much. And again, I know there were a lot of really great questions here. I will pass those on to Melanie, and I've posted links for our Google Plus community as well as Melanie's blog for our first year students. And Melanie, do you have anything you'd like to add here as we wrap up?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming and for listening to the lecture. It's been really fun. And I know it's getting late in the evening or day, so I don't want to hold up anybody else. But I appreciate everybody's attendance. It's really great.